Hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of Critical Conversations, where we discuss hot topic issues related to the Muslim world. Today we will focus our discussion on the rise of domestic violent extremism here in the United States, and to help us understand the phenomenon, we are joined by Mr. Daryl Johnson. Daryl is a former analyst at the Department of Homeland Security who is now the owner of DT Analytics, a private consulting firm for law enforcement and homeland security professionals. He has worked as a senior intelligence analyst, specializing in counterterrorism and threat analysis for the U.S. government since 1991. Daryl has appeared on NBC Nightly News, MSNBC, CNN, Headline News, Current TV, and has been quoted in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Newsweek, the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, and the New Yorker magazine on a variety of subjects related to domestic terrorism and extremism. Daryl, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being here. So over the past couple of years, we've seen this a rise in terrorist activity around the world, and especially here in the West, there's been an uptick of violence. And whether it's San Bernardino or Paris or Brussels, in all of these areas, we've been seeing a rise in terrorist activity. And because of that, there's a common refrain now that we hear that while every Muslim is not a terrorist, every terrorist is a Muslim. Now, would you agree with that perception in the context of the United States?
Well, unfortunately, that's a stereotype that's out there, and it's been perpetuated in the media. And the fact that our government officials don't call out other forms of terrorism for what it is, there is this misperception that every Muslim is a terrorist. Unfortunately, that is not the case. I totally disagree with that statement. We have a variety of forms of terrorists. We have those on the far right, such as militia extremists, your white supremacists. We also have sovereign citizens, people who reject the authority of the government and renounce their citizenship, don't pay their taxes, don't register their vehicles. We have anti-abortion extremists. And then we also have anarchists that are violent at times. We're getting ready for a presidential election. A lot of times these far leftist groups get agitated about national issues, and they lash out at the political conventions and the summits that are held. And then we also have single issue extremists, such as the animal rights extremists and the earth rights extremists. So there's a real broad spectrum of extremists here, and it's not of the Muslim variety. There's some misconceptions about terrorism that I'd like to address at this time. A lot of times people think that an act of terrorism has to be like a sensational 9/11 type of attack. And fortunately, we don't have a lot of those types of attacks here in the United States. They may come around maybe every 10, 15 years. We call those mass casualty producing attacks. Mm-hmm. Here domestically, we've been having terrorist attacks on a regular basis since the Obama administration took power back in 2008. And these terrorist attacks tend to be much smaller in scale. So you don't have the hundreds or 1,000 people being killed. You have 2 people being killed, or maybe a dozen people being killed. For example, we had the Sikh temple attack back in 2012, where a white supremacist entered a Sikh temple and gunned down 6 Sikh worshippers there, killing them in their house of worship. We had a similar attack in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015, where a white supremacist went in and killed African-American Christians that were having a Bible study. Mm-hmm. We've also had police officers that have been gunned down by sovereign citizens and killed. We had more recently, some of the black nationalist groups are getting violent towards police authorities. We had the attack in Dallas, Texas that killed 5 police officers, and another one in Baton Rouge soon thereafter that killed another 3 police officers. So these are the types of attacks that, as an analyst, we tracked and studied, and a lot of times people in the public just don't understand these are terrorist acts because they're not portrayed that way in the media, and the authorities call them hate crimes or other things and don't call it terrorism. So that's what kind of confuses the issue.
Sure. And so for the benefit of our audience, could you define how the government defines violent extremism and also terrorism?
Yeah, so in the academic community, there's a wide variety of definitions of terrorism. But for the U.S. government, it's codified in the federal code, and also the FBI has a definition for what domestic terrorism is versus international terrorism.
Right.
So there's three elements to terrorism. Basically, it's violence that's meant to instill fear in the population or change government policy that's ideologically motivated, or it could be socially motivated. So those are the three elements. And then as far as domestic terrorism, what makes that unique and distinct from international terrorism is there's no foreign influence or connection. So a lot of the Muslim American attacks that we see here in the homeland is kind of a manifestation of a recent phenomenon that we call homegrown violent extremism. But really, the FBI would characterize that as acts of international terrorism because of the connection to Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
And even if there's no direct connection and those individuals have been inspired by Al-Qaeda and ISIS without there being a direct link in terms of money having been transferred or support being given by ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but these individuals decide that they're inspired by their ideology and of their own accord carry out those terrorist activities. Is that domestic terrorism or domestic violent extremism, or still international terrorism?
Well, it's kind of a difficult subject. It's a new phenomenon, so you'll see terms in the news calling it domestic terrorism, but from an analytical standpoint in the U.S. government, we would still consider those acts of international terrorism because the calls for violence is coming from overseas and it's resonating with Americans here.
Right.
When we talk about domestic terrorism, we're talking about uniquely American movements and groups such as the Ku Klux Klan that was founded here in Pulaski, Tennessee, the militia movement, sovereign citizens, which are here in the United States. They really don't get direction from a foreign group or a foreign power.
Right. And so you've done extensive research on right-wing resurgence. In fact, you're the author of the book, Right-Wing Resurgence, How a Domestic Threat is Being Ignored. What would you say are the causes and the processes of radicalization of these of groups and individuals who are part of these groups?
Yeah, so you did differentiate groups versus lone individuals. I'm going to address both of those. Historically, here in America, we've had some terrorist groups that have formed. Like back in the 70s, we had, the Puerto Rican nationalist groups such as the Macheteros and FALN that were organized, had leadership, and got funding. We had some white supremacist groups that were responsible for terrorist acts here in America. Splinter groups from the Aryan nations, the Covenant Sword Arm of the Lord group. The way those types of groups radicalize is a lot of times you'll have people that were part of a mainstream cause or religion who have a more extreme interpretation, and so they break away from those mainstream groups and isolate themselves. In the case of the Covenant Sword Arm of the Lord as well as Aryan nations, they actually formed insular communities. People that left their homes, left their jobs, cut off ties with family members, and went to remote areas, whether it was Idaho or Arkansas, set up a community led by a charismatic leader that cuts off all communication with the outside world and becomes kind of a, religious figure. And that's an environment where a group can become more paranoid, more radical, because they're being directed by a single individual who's interpreting world events through their, apocalyptic view or their, extreme religious views. And so you get paranoia that takes over. A lot of times when you're isolated, you're prepping for, a confrontation with the government or the end of the world. So you start stockpiling food and you start stockpiling weapons and ammunition. You may start conducting paramilitary training, things like that. So basically, on the group side, you actually see a metamorphosis over time where these groups become more radicalized and make calls for violence. Now, more often than not, in modern day, we see lone individuals carrying out acts of terrorism, and that's a phenomenon that's evolved because of the advent of the internet, the way our communications are handled, and the technology that's developed. It's allowed people who in the past had actually joined an extremist group and become radicalized. Now they can do that in the comfort of their home and in the privacy of their home. And so in that respect, Muslims and right-wing extremists have that common connection where they radicalize on the internet, they read the propaganda, they buy into the propaganda, and they start, they're down the path of radicalization. And so, These are two different ways that we look at the problem, but more often than not, here in the United States, it's the lone offender that we look at.
And are there particular kinds of individuals who, whether within, say, the Muslim community or, say, right-wing groups or wherever, that are perhaps, or in the larger public, that are more susceptible to this kind of radicalization than others?
What research and studies have shown is people who are loners or have been cut off from the world, and people that have encountered some sort of traumatic life event. They go out seeking for new truths and new identities, and at that point, if they go on the internet and come across extremist propaganda, some of it's very glossy, very attractive, offers simplistic answers to very complex world problems, and sometimes people become vulnerable to the extremist messaging, and they find it appealing, and they accept that as their new truth. And one thing that we as human beings have in common that keep us grounded from becoming radicalized is we have these stabilizing influences in our life, these things that they call inhibitors. We have a good job that we like, or we're happily married. We have children or grandchildren that we look forward to seeing. Our network of friends, being involved in a faith-based community, having responsibilities in the community or joining a civic organization, volunteering. All these types of things help us feel integrated, part of a community where we don't feel isolated and we feel that we're contributing to a common good cause. And it's when people withdraw from that, or they get cut off from that because of, maybe they have some mental instabilities, or maybe they have some radical views that people find offensive, and they get cut off from these types of things, that they become even more vulnerable. Now, it's important also to notice that, people can become radicalized and pursue down this path to mobilization and carrying out a violent act, but there's always opportunities along that path of radicalization to realize that this isn't the truth, that this isn't something I want to do, and they could actually back away from that and de-escalate the radicalization.
And how would that happen? Where would that point of entry be, whether it's by the family or the community or law enforcement? Where would that point be?
Yeah, so it happens in a variety of occasions. A lot of it has to do with human interactions and breaking down the stereotypes that the extremist message puts out there. So in the case of some racist skinheads that I know about, one of them disassociated himself from the white supremacy movement because he went to prison and actually interacted with the minority races that he was taught to hate, and realized these people are human beings, they have families, they live a life similar to mine, they have similar grievances, they also have similar things that make them happy. There was another white supremacist who, when he was released from prison, the only person that would hire him was a Jewish man. And he became grateful for that individual because he was a convicted felon. Nobody would hire him. This Jewish man, despite the tattoos and the offensive statements he had, hired him in, showed him the true human nature of his Jewish community and his Jewishness. And the white supremacists rejected the message and later left the movement. In the case of sovereign citizens, a lot of these people join the sovereign citizen movement because they're financially desperate. They are over their heads in debt. The sovereign citizen movement gives them an easy way to supposedly get out of debt through these pseudo-legal paperwork that they file. Sometimes these people do that and then realize that they've been scammed. And so they say, you know what, I'm not going to be part of this movement anymore. So there's a lot of ways people can dial it back and reject the extremist message and reintegrate into the community. And more often than not, it takes a human being reaching out, someone that they were taught to hate, to show them love.
Sure. Daryl, when you were at the DHS in 2009, you led this research report on the rise of right-wing extremist violence here in America. And there was this report was leaked in 2009, and there was a lot of pushback that you received from conservative talk show hosts and conservative policymakers and others who felt that you had tarnished all church-going devout Christians. And you had in the report also mentioned the fact that some of these right-wing groups were trying to recruit returning military veterans as well. And so there was this big sort of furor about how, you might have sort of stigmatized this entire community. And that is sort of exactly how some Muslim community leaders feel about, the government's countering violent extremist efforts that are sort of focused on the Muslim community. And there are lots of parallels there, and they also feel that by focusing on the Muslim community, you're tarnishing an entire community and reinforcing this notion that, yes, that's where the terrorist threat lies. And so how would you, now that, you've done all of this research, how would you get around that? How do we talk about and identify a threat without, again, potentially stigmatizing the entire community?
Yeah, so I think it's very important. One of the lessons learned from the report that I wrote in 2009 was the importance of terminology, the words that we choose to describe the threat. Mm-hmm. So in my case, some of the words that were offensive or people found, kind of misinterpreted what they meant was the term right-wing. Mm-hmm. People thought we were talking about conservative Americans. Right-wing is just a political term that we use in the counterterrorism community to describe those threats that are on the far right of the political spectrum. So, white nationalists, some of the paramilitary groups that we have here, some of the anti-government groups and individuals. So, in hindsight, that's a misunderstanding on the part of the public what the term right-wing meant. Okay, we said right-wing extremism, mm-hmm. Not right-wing conservatism.
Right.
So there was a misunderstanding there. Something that we could have corrected and done better is I used the term disgruntled veterans, and if you read the subheading or the narrative under that heading, we were talking about veterans being targeted for recruitment, mm-hmm. Because they're returning home to an economy that had lapsed. Some of them may not be getting the health care treatment that they deserved. Some of them might not be able to find a job. And so they were vulnerable for these extremist groups to approach them and recruit. But if someone were to just glance at the report and see the term disgruntled veteran, mm-hmm. it sounds like these veterans were coming home angry and actively joining these groups with the intent of harming Americans. And that wasn't the message or intent of the paper. And lastly, we had a definition that was buried in a footnote of what a right-wing extremist is. Mm-hmm. In hindsight, we should have inserted a disqualifying language saying violent or criminally minded individuals. So we just, because we were dealing with a broad spectrum of extremists on the far right, we talking white supremacist groups, militia groups, sovereign citizens, anti-abortion extremists, we had to broaden that definition. And by broadening it, it made it too broad so that if someone took that definition out of context and just quoted it by itself, mm-hmm. and standing alone, it kind of gave the appearance that we were looking at all conservatives and Christians, when in reality we were only looking at those individuals who were endorsing, making calls for violence or mobilizing towards violence and committing criminal activity.
Sure. And so, in terms of how the government has responded to this threat, the right-wing terrorist threat, because there is this perception that most of the government resources, as far as domestic terrorism is concerned, are sort of focused on individuals that are inspired by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and not enough of that. In fact, you've written an entire book on that. So what do you think the government's response has been to right-wing terrorism? And also, are the resources being allocated effectively, given the level of threats from both areas?
Yeah, so before I address the resources and the government's response, let's just kind of talk a little bit about the differences between these two forms of terrorism, mm-hmm. okay? So Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, as well as ISIS, they're known for conducting, mass casualty producing attacks, coordinated attacks where you have multiple attacks being conducted simultaneously, like we saw in Paris. So the threat is a little different. It's when they do come out and strike, they're striking at a large number of people. They tend to target innocent civilians. And so the government's response needs to be geared towards preventing those types of attacks. Okay, protecting civilians, protecting against the mass casualty producing attack, whether it's a large vehicle bomb or whether it's multiple shooters, gunning down people at multiple locations. Domestic terrorism, as I said earlier, is more small in scale. we tend to see them target ethnic communities rather than innocent civilians, or they may target government officials. So that's another reason why the media and sometimes the public doesn't understand police officers getting shot.
Sure.
You know, they're police officers. They have dangerous jobs. They encounter violent criminals all the time. So why would that be an act of terrorism when a police officer is shot? And again, you have to go back to the definition of what the motivation was. Was it a drug dealer who's just doing this because of revenge or because he's, you know, protecting the interests of his, you know, criminal enterprise? Or is it ideologically motivated, like a sovereign citizen killing a police officer, where he's doing it because he doesn't recognize the authority of the police? Same with the black nationalists that we saw shoot the police officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge. So you have to understand that initially, that domestic terrorism is small in scale, international terrorism tends to be more large in scale and coordinated type of attacks. So the government's response to both of these is different. Obviously overseas, we're not inhibited by, you know, First Amendment protected speech or any other constitutional rights. We can go after terrorists on foreign soil using drone strikes, using special forces, operations, things like that. Here at home, we have to respect these constitutional rights, and so the government's response is different, and it's also limited. So, you know, the police have to have probable cause before they investigate someone and conduct an undercover operation. A lot of times when a terrorist is identified and arrested, you got to protect that individual and his rights when he gets arrested. He gets read constitutional rights, and he's got to go through a trial and a jury before he's found guilty or innocent. So there's all these other considerations that you have to take into effect. My final point is how many analysts do we devote to these problems? Are the resources being properly allocated? Definitely on the international terrorism side, as well as combating the homegrown violent extremism from within America, I think there's, you know, hundreds, literally hundreds, if not thousands of government analysts, multiple agencies coordinating their response to these threats. So, you know, on the domestic side, we don't have that luxury. Basically, we have the FBI, and before my unit was disbanded, we had Homeland Security. We were the only two government agencies that were looking at the non-Islamic terrorist threat in America. Now you just have the FBI. And from, you know, an intelligence perspective, you have both strategic and tactical. The FBI has plussed up its tactical intelligence analytic capability because of the threat, and I applaud that effort. The strategic side hasn't grown a single bit in their unit, and then ours was dissolved. Strategic intelligence looks at the big picture, national trends, what new movements and groups are emerging that terrorists could, you know, spawn from. What type of criminal tradecraft are they using? What are the new tactics they're going to be using, you know, for the next terrorist attack? That's what's missing in the government's response to terrorism, is this domestic piece. And the FBI is also a federal law enforcement agency. Unlike the Office of Intelligence that I worked for at DHS, we were not a law enforcement agency. So the FBI has rules and regulations where it has to operate like a law enforcement agency. They have to have probable cause before they investigate. You know, crime has to be committed or suspected of being committed. We, on the other hand, looked at threats to safety. So if we had a pattern or historical evidence that a particular group or ideology perpetuated violence, we would look at those things and try to prevent it before it happens. So that piece is missing now.
Right. And so, I mean, do you think that you know, the current political climate with the presidential campaigns going on and everything, do you think that is going to exacerbate this, the right-wing extremist threat that you have focused on, or is that going, and do you think there's going to be then a shift in government resources as far as that's concerned?
Yeah, so whenever we enter an election year, there could be a change in administration from, you know, Republican to Democrat, from Democrat to Republican. And what I've seen over the past few decades here in America is a lot of the domestic terrorism is tied to these election cycles. So when we tend to have Democratic administration officials in power, it agitates the far right, and you see those groups getting strengthened and more agitated and violent. When we have Republican administrations that come into power, that seems to pacify the far right, and they kind of fall, decrease their activities, and then the far left gets agitated. So we're kind of at this point of, crossroads where we're seeing both far right and far left attacks being initiated. And just to let you know, some of the recent police shootings that I've talked about, the Dallas and Baton Rouge that were carried out by black nationalists, we haven't seen that level of violence from black nationalists in probably 3 decades.
Wow.
Since the 1970s.
Wow.
So that's how, I guess, important it is to watch the election cycle and see where, which administration comes into power, so we can kind of predict which groups may, rise up to be more of a threat. And that's exactly what we did in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected. It was a combination of Barack Obama being African American, being a Democrat, which the far right despises because they tend to, favor gun control, and they tend to favor, policies for minorities and things like that. So that agitates the hate groups and the anti-government groups. When you get the Republicans in power, it's the regulation that they kind of dial back on, and so the environment suffers, and so you get the environmentalists spun up and the animal rights and other people. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few months, and we may have a new threat emerging once again.
Right, right. Well, on that not very happy note, thank you so much, Daryl, for your time. We learned so much from this conversation, and you gave us a lot to think about. So
I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Absolutely. So until next time, this is your host, Mahlaka Samdani.